So you may recall that Douglas Murray was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was debating Dave Smith about his views on Israel and its war against Hamas. And Douglas was a little disturbed that Joe Rogan seemed to have predominantly on his show people talking about issues, whether it's Israel, Hamas, Russia, and Ukraine, who aren't well versed. It's not their expertise. It's not their subject. And I'm all for free speech, and as is Douglas. But at the very least, you have to have people on, in addition to those who have very niche, not thoroughly researched viewpoints. You also have to have people with mainstream views who are also experts if you're going to be one of the biggest platforms in the world and want to act responsibly, so that people can make their own minds up. You have to have, you have to give credence to certainly the mainstream views if you're going to give credence to left field views. But Dave Smith joined Piers Morgan recently. Dave was the guy that was sort of against what Israel's doing with Hamas. And here he is getting another takedown from John Spencer. Now, for those who aren't familiar with who John Spencer is, John is a retired United States Army officer and a researcher of urban warfare and an author, currently serving as the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute. So this is an expert when it comes to warfare. So anyway, let's have a look at this little excerpt where he reviews what happened with Dave and Douglas Murray on the Joe Rogan show. Have a watch.
And even in your example there, if I were to give out pamphlets, give out a warning, tell everybody I'd really like you to leave, and then they didn't, and I blew up a building, we would consider that intentional murder. Now, my point, I think a lot of times people object to almost what the implications of this way of looking at the world might be, but forget all of that for a second. I'm just talking about how human beings think about these things. And when you talk about an intentional killing, now, by the way, I should also stipulate that it's not as if that's the case in every single one of these strikes that Israel's taken, and we've gotten all types of evidence about this, and there's quite a number of cases, hundreds of cases, where they're waiting for terrorists to go back into a residential building and then attacking the building, suspected terrorists, I should say. But regardless, none of this is even really the point. The point is that on a very basic human level, and I would also think this is completely incompatible with Christianity, although I'm not trying to lecture anybody about that, but there is no micro and macro morality. There is no micro and macro intentionality. These are human concepts. And if you are dropping a bomb and you know that there are women and children on the receiving end of that bomb, then that was done intentionally. And I think this is the reality of war. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about this, we should deal with it in reality.
Yeah, and also, John, I'll get you to respond to that. But I mean, it just seems to me, having done so many debates about this since October the 7th, I've never disputed that Israel had a right to defend itself. In fact, a duty to defend itself and its people from any further attacks of that magnitude, given how horrific it was. So let me just restate that again. But there's a kind of unique battlefield in Gaza. I would argue, and maybe you would argue differently, that you've got 2 million people, 50% of whom are under 18. And that the enemy are all living in civilian areas amongst the civilians. So you have a kind of horrific battleground, if you like, to attack if you're Israel, in the sense that you can only constantly kill a lot of civilians, including children, if you go after the enemy in those civilian areas. And that's exactly what's happened. And I can't think of a similar war, and maybe you can, you're more experienced at this, I accept, than I am, but can you think of another scenario where the proportion of children that is in the attack zone has been at 50% or higher, and therefore we're seeing so many children being killed?
So look, yeah, that's the case study or comparative model that you could do the research on. How does this compare to anything else? And it doesn't, right? The 20 years of preparing Gaza for war, the 400 miles of tunnels, the human sacrifice strategy, because both sides actually have legal obligations. When Hamas says, I need the death of my women and children, that's not right. So the data about what is the population. So one, I don't want to be, heartless about it. And every death of a child is terrible. But you're evaluating anybody who's below the 18 as a child. As in, that Hamas has basically children. I joined the military at 17. Am I a child? And Hamas deploys. The average age of a Hamas recruit right now is 16 and a half. We've seen them put weapons in hands of very young children. You have combatant and you have non-combatant. Is there any comparable status to the demographic of Gaza? No. Is there any comparison to where another country, Egypt, refuses to let even those that want out from the combat areas, and Israel, who took weeks to evacuate the civilians from the areas they're going into? So absolutely, there are so many here. But back to Dave's comment, which it stands on itself, explaining what he doesn't know about war or the laws of war, about them being codified and when they went into effect. Or this is a simple question of morality that war should be no killing of civilians. That should be it. You two military should go find your place to fight and just have it out. That's not the history of war from the creation literally of city-states going out and everything.
I think
If you want to get into the frameworks to judge, the frameworks to judge war, we as societies, all the societies of war, the Geneva Conventions is one example, have decided here are the boundaries of brutality of war. Like we don't bomb innocent civilians. And you cannot say, I don't care what your Haaretz articles say, you're not going to show me that Israel has targeted civilians, intentionally killing civilians. When I can show you measures that Israel has taken that no military in the history of war have taken to get civilians out of harm's way so they can target that terrorist. You once said on a podcast, if the terrorist is holding a baby and shooting at you, then of course you can kill the terrorist. And unfortunately, what they're doing is wrong. But then I understand that when we have cases of Hamas doing that, holding children so nobody will shoot at them, or going underneath a hospital, a school, a mosque, doing what we call lawfare. You have to have an understanding of the evolutions of the law of war, how it is adjudicated. When you say evidence, I mean evidence, not TikTok videos. I mean actual evidence of what did the person dropping the commander know? What did he do to prevent it? What time did he do it? What type of munition did he use? Dave's statement stand on his own of showing that he doesn't know the foundations of war, even if it's what you call a just war, just execution of the war. You're just not communicating that you know enough to make a statement like that. I'm just philosophically talking about killing civilians is wrong. That's what the law of war says. It says don't target civilians. What Hamas did on October 7th. It doesn't say 0 civilians will die in a war. There's a precaution law of war. There is the feasible things you do to prevent the civilian death. But you can't say Israel hasn't done that. And I'm saying, based on my research, not an appeal to expertise, going there, interviewing IDF soldiers, commanders, Netanyahu himself, I'm saying Israel is not targeting or intentionally trying to kill civilians. They're doing the opposite more than anybody else.
So here's the thing. From a Western standard point of view, Israel has fought this war against Hamas to the highest possible standards. You talk about children being killed and all of that. As John Spencer rightly points out, many people consider children or actually could be Hamas fighters. People who are 16, 17. According to the data that we have from the Gaza Health Ministry, considering the fact that also they lump together those, people killed that die through natural means, just as would happen in any year, as well as those that die in war. Considering that there's a disproportionate amount of people, especially in the younger category, who are male gender, and from IDF data as well, and from international data sources, right now it looks like that Israel has achieved one of the most precise ratios of combatant to non-combatant killed in the history of modern urban warfare, where it's between 1-to-1 to potentially 2-to-1 combatants to non-combatants killed. It's unheard of. So I don't really know what more Dave could want. Secondly, Israel's doing these things like saying, we're gonna let civilians know in advance. Western standards say, yeah, great, we like that, we appreciate that. It actually turns out that Jewish morality, from what I can understand, wouldn't permit you to do anything that could give the enemy an advantage. You warn the enemy that you're going to go in and and bomb one of their key units. That could give them a massive advantage. That could allow their people time to leave, their fighters time to leave, time to prepare. The onus of all the death and war that occurs is on the one that starts it, the aggressors, on Hamas. That's when it comes to warning civilians and warning people in advance. Then when it comes to the whole issue of human shields, the notion that Dave seems to kind of be peddling that, well, if they use human shields, there comes a point where it's too much. No. The more you say we're not going to fight because you're using human shields, the more you're intimidated or change your tactics because they're using human shields, the more you encourage them to use human shields, the more innocent human beings become shields and die. The more Israel was to say, I don't care, of course we care, but whether or not you use human shields, we are going to go in and fight no different, then they won't be incentivized to take human shields. This is where, it's interesting, he mentioned this Christian morality. In some ways, there's clearly a distinction between Jewish and Christian morality. Christian morality in some ways on these matters seems a little bit too suicidal, which is probably a result of a religion that focuses too much from a Jewish point of view on the next world and not enough on preserving life here down on earth. And then there's a third principle, which is who is a civilian? This is again where Western moral standards and Jewish moral standards are different. Seems from what I can understand of Jewish morality that a civilian is defined as someone that surrenders. Someone that identifies himself as not wanting to fight, not being part of the aggressor nation or government. You say, what about children? Well, it's a responsibility of their parents, the children are. It can't be Israel's responsibility, or any nation that gets attacked, their responsibility to risk their own soldiers and their own people's lives to protect the other side's quote-unquote civilians. How can you possibly make a distinction, especially when Hamas use human shields, dress up in civilian clothing, in the heat of battle to make such quick decisions about who is and isn't a civilian? That is, the standards that the IDF have put to are just absurd. It's suicidal. So yes, Torah says you don't kill civilians. Here's the question: who is a civilian? What I am saying may sound harsh, but this is sane. And it's certainly Jewish. And I sometimes wonder, is it worth Israel trying to dance to Western moral standards when it doesn't seem like the West even seem to care that much? The more Israel shows military precision at the price of its own people, the more it's accused of committing genocide. And then, of course, there's the issue of one's supplying one's enemy with aid. I'm sure you can guess what I think and what it seems Jewish morality would say about that. It's absurd. It actually prolongs suffering for both sides. So we need to inject more sanity into this whole conversation.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.